If you open this video, then you are about to hear the real story and see real photographs of Bonnie and Clyde. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. After watching, leave a comment with your thoughts, reactions, or suggestions. It helps preserve real historical memory. Now, let us begin. The images and accounts that follow are not movie scenes and not romantic legend. They are records of real events that unfolded during one of the most difficult periods in American history, the Great Depression. At that time, millions of families lost their homes, savings, and work. Banks collapsed. Factories closed. Agricultural land dried out. Entire communities traveled from state to state seeking jobs that did not exist. The country was full of hunger, abandonment, and bitterness. In these conditions, law enforcement structures were weak, fragmented, and poorly coordinated. The environment was unstable. And instability is always a point where crime begins to grow. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow entered history not because they were born criminals, but because their lives unfolded within this collapse. Their partnership formed in 1930 in Dallas, Texas. Both were in their early 20s. Both lived in working-class neighborhoods. Both saw their families struggle to survive. And both felt that the system around them gave no avenue for stability, progress, or dignity. When they met, the attraction was immediate, not just emotional, but ideological. They recognized each other as someone who would not leave, someone who would stand beside the other no matter the conditions. Shortly after they met, Clyde was arrested on charges of auto theft and robbery and sent to the Eastham prison farm. The conditions at Eastham were severe. Prisoners labored in fields under armed guards. Violence was routine, sometimes encouraged by the guards. Clyde's time there changed his outlook permanently. He entered prison as a young thief. He left prison as someone who no longer believed society offered him any lawful path to survival. If captured again, he assumed he would be beaten, humiliated, or killed. That belief shaped every decision he made afterward. When Clyde was released in 1932, he reunited with Bonnie. Their life together did not begin with dramatic bank robberies or car chases. It began with small thefts, gas stations, grocery stores, roadside cafes. These targets were chosen because they required little planning and provided immediate cash. But the profit was minimal. A typical robbery produced just enough money to buy food, fuel, and ammunition. The necessity of constant movement became absolute. Staying in one place for more than a day risked recognition and capture. Clyde's greatest advantage was mobility. He learned the geography of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and Louisiana with precision. He knew which counties had slower law enforcement response times. He knew which small bridges could be crossed at high speed and which would collapse. He understood where dirt roads connected to state roads, where fences could be cut, where wooded areas provided cover. The Ford V8 automobile became his most important tool. In that era, few police vehicles could match its speed and engine strength. Clyde drove aggressively, often at speeds that would cause police vehicles to lose traction on gravel roads. He practiced these moves. For him, driving was not transportation, it was survival. The Barrow gang formed gradually. W.D. Jones joined because he had no stable home and nowhere to go. Clyde's older brother Buck joined after attempting to follow social expectations and failing. Buck's wife Blanche became part of the group because loyalty to her husband outweighed her personal wishes. Later, Henry Methven joined, bringing with him insecurities and instability that would alter the course of the gang's final months. The group did not operate like organized criminals. They operated like people who were constantly escaping, constantly adapting, and constantly reacting. Their robberies were almost always short and chaotic. They entered a store, demanded money at gunpoint, grabbed the cash drawer, and fled. They did not wait to open safes. They did not target large banks unless absolutely necessary. They preferred speed over profit. The national myth of Bonnie and Clyde as glamorous bank robbers grew largely from photographs, not their actual actions. Most of the businesses they targeted were small enterprises already struggling during the Depression. These robberies harmed ordinary people, gas station attendants, shop owners, clerks, individuals already living in hardship. The turning point in public perception came from a single camera. In April 1933, during a police raid in Joplin, Missouri, the gang escaped, but left behind a roll of undeveloped film. When processed, the photos showed Bonnie smiling with a pistol and cigar, and Clyde posing confidently with a shotgun. These images spread across American newspapers rapidly. For a public crushed by economic failure, these images seemed to represent rebellion. The notion of two lovers against the world resonated with people who felt betrayed by institutions. But the myth was inaccurate. The real Bonnie and Clyde were exhausted, often starving, constantly injured, and emotionally strained. In the summer of 1933, a car accident resulted in a gasoline fire that severely burned Bonnie's right leg. The burns were deep, leaving tissue damaged permanently. She had difficulty walking and often required Clyde's physical support to move. The pain was constant and severe. No hospital would treat them. They used home remedies, primitive bandages, and improvised pain relief. The newspapers did not print this truth. The myth was more appealing. By early 1934, law enforcement began coordinating across state lines. The gang's escape advantage was shrinking. Officers no longer approached suspicious vehicles casually. They approached with weapons ready. Bonnie and Clyde, believing that capture meant death or torture, fired first. This led to multiple police fatalities during what would have been routine questioning procedures. As deaths increased, public sympathy vanished. The label changed from outlaws to killers. On April 1, 1934, near Grapevine, Texas, two young highway patrolmen approached what appeared to be a stranded vehicle. Clyde recognized the threat immediately and opened fire. Both officers were killed. This moment eliminated any remaining public admiration. Newspapers no longer printed romantic stories. They printed calls for immediate execution. Law enforcement turned to a man who was not bound by standard procedure, former Texas Ranger Frank Harmer. Harmer had built his career pursuing fugitives across rural territory. He understood how to watch patterns. He began tracking the gang not by chasing them directly, but by studying where they refueled, where they slept, and where they sought help. He noted that the gang always returned to Louisiana. They trusted specific backwoods areas and certain families. This trust would become their downfall. Henry Methvin's father entered an arrangement with law enforcement. If he assisted in capturing Bonnie and Clyde, his son would be spared the death penalty. The ambush site was selected on Highway 154, near Gibbsland, Louisiana. The location provided concealment, limited sightlines, and no viable escape routes. On the morning of May 23, 1934, officers waited in silence along the roadside. When Clyde's Ford V8 approached, he slowed after recognizing the staged breakdown setup involving Methvin's truck. Frank Harmer fired the first shot, directly at Clyde's head. The remaining officers opened sustained fire upon the vehicle. Automatic rifle rounds penetrated the windshield, doors, and interior frame. Bonnie and Clyde died almost instantly. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. When the bodies were transported to the nearest town, crowds gathered almost immediately. People attempted to touch the bodies, tear pieces of clothing, and claim fragments of the bullet-riddled car. News photographers documented everything. The myth did not disappear, but it changed. The world saw not glamorous outlaws, but two young people destroyed by the life they lived. Bonnie was 23. Clyde was 25. They were buried separately, as Bonnie's family refused to allow them to be laid to rest together. Their story became legend not because of who they were, but because of what America was at the time, a country desperate for meaning and hardship. Films, songs, and novels later turned them into tragic rebels. But the historical truth is stark. They lived in fear, hunger, pain, and constant threat. They killed and were killed because the world had collapsed around them, and they saw no place in it. Their story is not a celebration. It is a warning about what happens when society fails. When institutions collapse, violence rises. When hope disappears, desperation replaces it. And when desperation becomes normal, tragedy follows. This is the real story of Bonnie and Clyde. Remember it clearly, not as legend, but as evidence of what the collapse of stability creates. The story of Bonnie and Clyde did not end with the ambush. In many ways, what followed became just as revealing about the United States of the 1930s as their years on the run. The country reacted not only to the deaths of two fugitives, but to what they had come to represent, the collision of economic despair, public frustration, and institutional weakness. After the ambush, their bodies were transported to a funeral home in Arcadia, Louisiana. The funeral home quickly became surrounded by crowds. Men, women, and children pressed forward to look at the bullet-torn car and the bodies inside it. Some pushed close enough to tear fabric from Bonnie's dress, or to touch Clyde's hair. The coroner and police could not keep order. The crowd had not come to mourn. They had come to witness the end of a story they had watched spread across newspapers for 2 years. The Ford V8 in which they died was later displayed publicly. People paid money to see it. The bloodstains remained visible. Bullet holes lined the doors, the windshield, the seats. The vehicle became a traveling exhibit, a reminder of violence turned into spectacle. The car was not treated as evidence of tragedy, but as entertainment. This reaction revealed how deeply the myth had taken hold. The line between reality and performance had collapsed. Bonnie and Clyde were not celebrities in life, but they became icons in death. In Dallas, Clyde's family held his funeral first. Hundreds arrived. Some out of sympathy, others from morbid curiosity. Many came because they recognized the faces from newspapers and wanted to know if the reality matched the photographs. Clyde was buried in Western Heights Cemetery. He had once requested to be buried beside Bonnie. That wish was denied. Bonnie's funeral followed. Her mother refused to allow the two to be buried together. She believed that Clyde had pulled her daughter into a life that destroyed her. Bonnie's funeral drew thousands. Streets were blocked. Cars lined highways. People stood on rooftops. Bonnie was buried in Fishtrap Cemetery, later moved to Crown Hill Cemetery. Even decades later, flowers, notes, and letters would appear at her grave. But the attention did not end at the burial. Newspapers printed retrospectives, special reports, reconstructed timelines. Radios discussed the meaning of the outlaw couple. Hollywood screenplays were drafted almost immediately. Songs were written that same summer. Some portrayed them as romantic martyrs, others as ruthless killers. The argument over who they really were began before the ground settled on the graves. To understand why their image endured, one must understand the conditions under which they lived. The United States was a nation divided not only by class, but by trust. The Depression did not simply destroy jobs and homes, it destroyed institutional credibility. People no longer believed banks would protect savings. They no longer believed the government could provide stability. They no longer believed the system was fair. In this environment, anyone who visibly rejected authority attracted attention. Bonnie and Clyde did not represent ideology. They represented refusal. But while the myth grew, the consequences of their actions remained. The families of officers killed during traffic stops never forgot what happened. Communities that had been terrorized by sudden gunfire remembered the fear. The clerks robbed at gunpoint, the witnesses threatened, the bystanders injured. These lives did not fit into romantic narratives. Their losses remained private, quiet, and permanent. In 1935, 1 year after the ambush, law enforcement agencies issued a report summarizing the Barrow gang's movements, crimes, and escapes. The report emphasized 3 key failures that had allowed the gang to survive as long as they did: lack of communication between jurisdictions. Sheriffs in different counties did not share information effectively. Bonnie and Clyde used county borders as escape routes. Inferior equipment. Police vehicles and firearms were often outdated. The gang used stolen military weapons and faster cars. Underestimation of desperation. Officers expected criminals to surrender when surrounded. Bonnie and Clyde did not. Their assumption that they would be killed if captured made negotiation impossible. This report became part of the foundation for the development of coordinated interstate law enforcement. Within a decade, police agencies would have radio systems linking counties, then states. Patrol cars would improve. Firearms standards would be updated. And federal agencies would take a more active role in cross-state pursuit. In other words, Bonnie and Clyde did not just commit crimes. Their actions reshaped policing in the United States. Meanwhile, their image continued to evolve. Writers, filmmakers, and musicians reshaped their story to suit different cultural eras. In times of disillusionment, they were portrayed as rebels. In times of public order focus, they were portrayed as predators. Their story was retold more than it was studied. Each generation projected its own anxieties onto them. But the historical Bonnie and Clyde were neither heroes nor legends. They were 2 young people shaped by a collapsing nation, driven by hunger, survival instinct, and trauma. Their loyalty to one another was real, but loyalty does not excuse harm. They were both perpetrators and victims of their time. To speak of them honestly requires holding both truths simultaneously. They caused suffering, and they suffered. They escaped authority, and they were trapped by circumstance. They were admired, and feared. They were myth, and they were flesh. In the end, their story is not about crime. It is about collapse. When society fails to protect its people, some will choose to burn rather than bow. Bonnie and Clyde were not symbols of freedom. They were signals of warning. The story of Bonnie and Clyde does not end with bullets, headlines, or the broken windshield of a Ford V8. Their deaths mark the conclusion of a pursuit, but not the conclusion of the impact they left behind. What followed was not silence, but echo, an echo that moved through newspapers, families, law enforcement reports, court archives, academic studies, folk music, literature, film, and eventually the digital memory of the world. To understand why their story continued, we must look not at the myth that formed around them, but at the conditions that allowed that myth to survive. The United States in the years following their deaths remained a nation struggling to rebuild trust. The Great Depression had inflicted damage not just on bank accounts, but on belief. People questioned whether the institutions around them could provide stability. The government launched new programs, jobs relief, and financial reforms, attempting to re-establish confidence. But confidence is not restored by law alone, it is restored by memory. And memory does not always choose what is accurate. It chooses what is emotionally useful. The memory of Bonnie and Clyde became emotionally useful. Some remembered them as symbols of defiance, two people who refused to be broken. Others remembered them as warnings, two people destroyed by the violence they embraced. And some remembered only the images, Bonnie with a pistol and a cigarette, Clyde leaning against a stolen car, both smiling as if the world around them had never touched them. The photographs survived because they were simple. The truth survived only in fragments, in police files, witness statements, autopsy reports, and the private testimonies of those who suffered. Look closely at the real record and a different picture forms: fatigue, hunger, fear, infection, wounds that never healed, paranoia that grew with every passing night, the constant awareness that one wrong turn, one moment of hesitation, one misplaced trust would end everything. Their life was not an adventure. It was a narrowing corridor. With each mile, each robbery, each shot fired, the walls closed in tighter. And yet, the idea of Bonnie and Clyde lived on. The idea was easier to carry than the truth. In American culture, stories of outlaws have always been more than entertainment. They are reflections of national tension, moments when individuals push back against power structures. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, John Dillinger, Bonnie, and Clyde. Each of these figures became symbols during times when society felt fractured. When people feel powerless, they become drawn to those who refuse to play by the rules. This does not mean admiration. It means recognition. Bonnie and Clyde were not superhuman. They were not fearless. They were not strategic masterminds. They were two young people who believed the world had no place for them, and who responded by rejecting the world in return. Every decision after that grew from the first. If society had closed its doors, then society would not be obeyed. But rejection is not liberation. Rejection is a trap. The same path that frees someone from one kind of cage builds another. The Barrow gang lived in that trap for 2 years. It ended exactly the way such traps always end: in exhaustion, in escalation, and in death. Law enforcement did not become stronger because of Bonnie and Clyde. Law enforcement became stronger because it had to. The gang exposed weaknesses, jurisdiction gaps, slow communication, outdated equipment, fragmented authority. Their story accelerated the modernization of American policing. Radios became standard. Vehicle fleets improved. Interstate cooperation increased. Federal jurisdiction expanded. The legend of Bonnie and Clyde grew, not because their crimes were exceptional, but because the consequences of those crimes reshaped institutions. The tragedy is this: they did not intend to reshape anything. They were not political. They were not revolutionary. They were simply trying to survive in a world that had already failed them. Survival became a weapon. A weapon became identity. Identity became myth. And myth became the memory that outlived them. But myth has a cost. The families of the officers killed never saw romance in the story. The children who lost fathers did not write folk songs. The shopkeepers robbed at gunpoint did not collect newspaper clippings. Their story is also here, silent, heavy, unglamorous. History that is not photographed, not sung, not filmed, but lived. That part must not be erased. So what does the story of Bonnie and Clyde teach? Not that rebellion is beautiful. Not that love conquers the world. Not that freedom is found through destruction. Their story teaches that when structures fall apart, when hunger becomes normal, when stability collapses, when the future disappears, people will take paths they once believed impossible. And once that path is taken, it is almost impossible to return. This is not about who Bonnie and Clyde were. This is about what made them possible. History does not repeat through names. History repeats through conditions. If the pressure that formed them were to return, something similar would rise again, with different faces, different roads, different headlines, but the same roots. This is why remembering matters. Not the myth. Not the glamour. Not the movie version. The real story. 2 lives shaped by desperation. 2 lives consumed by violence. 2 lives that could have been ordinary, in another time, another economy, another world. The story of Bonnie and Clyde is a mirror. It shows us not who they were, but who we can become when society breaks.